Welcome back to Psychology Applied to Work. This is lecture 19, Training. All right, recall, lecture 18 was a bonus lecture. We talked about human complexity and performance. We covered the implicit job and self-narratives. We defined productivity. We talked about comparing oneself to others. And we talked about agency and hierarchy. Today is chapter 7. So this will be beginning of unit 3. You will find that the majority of the test questions for unit 3 will come from this lecture, training, and not so much, not as many things from the next lecture, development, just because of the way the book weighs more heavily on training. Development is still just as important, but that's a little clue for those of you who are watching the videos. So this is lecture is very straightforward. There's a lot of slides, but there aren't too many dangerous places in the slide where I might start pontificating and chasing squirrels. So this has a decent chance of being a lecture that doesn't go long. We're going to find out together. So after we talk about what is training, we're going to talk about who provides the training. We're going to talk about these things called training objects, and we're going to talk about training the trainers. We're going to talk about the pre-training environment. We're going to talk about types of training. We've got a few different slides on that. And then we're going to talk about post-training. And finally, we're going to talk about labor shortages and how labor scarcity versus surplus, changes sort of the calculus in organizations about how to prioritize training. All right, so what is training? Training is, that is pretty straightforward. We kind of know what training is. It's the education for the skills you need for the job, and you could look at anything that's skills isn't just skills from KSAOs, though it certainly would include that, but it can be the how or the what. It can be the task-specific things. Here is how you do this exact job, but it also could be the knowledge, and it could be the skills. It's a little less likely to be abilities, a little less likely to be the other characteristics of KSAOs, but it's basically things that a employee or a worker needs to be able to do their job and do it well, that an organization for many reasons has decided that it needs to take on the responsibility to teach this, or to pay for other parties to teach it. Another important thing here is this concept of transfer, which is, it's a fancy conceptualization around, did you learn it or not? Did the training take? Did the training transfer? So you hear this term, transfer of training. So you have a trainer and a trainee, and the trainer's job is to transfer the training. The way the training is set up, the type of training that it is, and all the delivery methods and the way the trainer goes through it, all of those things affect how well the training might be transferred. And then the trainee themselves are there to to properly absorb and recall and demonstrate that the transfer occurred. And like teaching anything, I'm now teaching you. You may or may not be listening. You may or may not be engaged. You may or may not have mapped the success of yourself in this class to a meta-narrative or a meta-goal for your life. And so you at varying levels of motivation and engagement, which will definitely affect your success in this class. But I am attempting to transfer this knowledge to you. So transfer training, that's really the main goal. Why are we doing this? Well, we're doing it to transfer. We're doing it to teach. Development usually goes hand in glove with training, but you can think of The training is, this is what you need to do your job. And development is more, this is what you might need for your next job. Or this is what you need in order to grow your current job. So development is typically future oriented, and that might be broad, so that it improves your chances for landing a better job, or just generally improves your skills for what you might face in the future that the organization might deem beneficial. But training is usually very near term. It's usually to address the specifics of your job, and if you and that might be because there's a new change in what you need to pay attention to or do in your job. But it's typically the more the here and now and the certain, and the development is typically the future, and it isn't necessarily a certainty. And then depending upon the organization, training is more typically the responsibility of the organization, and development is sort of a blend. And sometimes development is the situation for development is usually that the person being developed has to be assertive in some manner or another. To some extent, I'm providing you training, but you also took the initiative to go to university, to jump through hoops to get in, to enroll in this class, because it's connected in some fashion to a longer term goal, for a future state where you want to be employed and make a lot of money and be fulfilled and all that stuff. So you are working on your development, and as part of that process, we have a training event going on. So hopefully that sort of nests it without complexifying it. All right, so the United States spends about $100 billion a year on formal training, and that's just the formal training. That's where an organization actually has a bill associated with it, or they've dedicated a certain number of staff to it, and they can account for it. As an example, the giant global corporation McDonald's, they do formal training. They have places they often call Hamburger University or Hamburger U, and they actually have those training centers all around the world. But on top of that 100 million, much more money ends up being spent in what is effectively informal training. There's people, they're in a job, they don't quite know all of the aspects of their job, and so they're getting some form of on-the-job training, either because somebody's there to mentor them, or they're just learning as they go, and they're not as productive. And so the money spent by organizations on informal training is usually just paid for via inefficiency. Paid for in the sense that it takes you 2 hours to do something. It takes you 2 hours, and you ask 3 different people questions and use up 20 minutes of their time to accomplish the task that in a couple months, after you've done it enough and figured things out enough, and they're starting to get it, so to speak, maybe it only takes you 20 minutes. So that extra time plus the burdening of the time of the people that were helping you is all money that to some extent the organization is investing, not because they want to, because they have to help you get up to speed. And it's very difficult to capture exactly how much that is, because when does it end? There are people who in 5 years in a job, if the job hasn't changed much, but if the job is complex or fast-paced and difficult, you might be getting better and better every year. And so at what point do you say that's informal training because you're learning how to get better, and at what point does it not make sense to do that? So you can't really say how much money gets spent on that, but it's a lot more than 100 billion that's spent on formal training. All right, so training, as I stated, is typically more here and now, targeted at the specific things you need to do the job. It's not typically done for general knowledge, abstract knowledge, skills that don't necessarily apply to work. An organization is not likely to have Greek philosophy Wednesdays and pay you to attend it for all afternoon. Things like critical thinking skills. If you could bottle that up in a way that an organization could pay for that, and you could go to it for like a 2-hour training and come out of it with amazing critical thinking skills, sure. But the reality is nobody knows how to do that. One of the things that people advocate for liberal arts degrees for. It's worded terribly, but one of the benefits of a liberal arts degree is critical thinking skills. Well, that's 4 years, and that's not something organizations can pay for, so I can justify paying for. So abstract general skills is not typically something that organizations would cover under training. So it's really, training is calibrated as well. It's like what's the baseline, what's the foundation knowledge that we need, and what level are the people we're bringing into our organization have. So what's the gap we need to fill? So it actually could be maybe you're in a factory and it's assembly type work, kind of work you might be able to train somebody on the steps within just a few hours, and then some of the more complex stuff just within a couple days, and maybe you have really fast turnover. And so you're constantly, for better or for worse, churning through people, and you need to make the best of the time that they're there. So, and maybe your only requirement is that they be able to stand up, follow instructions in English, and maybe they don't even have to speak English, but they certainly have to understand it enough. Some minimal assembly type thing, or a giant fulfillment center or something like that. So that might be like the baseline. And then as you move up of what are your requirements in your organization or for a particular role, maybe the people do need to read is another level. And then there's various educational levels and skills and knowledge levels needed. If you're a back-end software company, you would need a great deal of foundational skills before you can even train the people on the stuff that's unique to your business. So where you apply the training is really about, what's the gap between the types of people you either have or are able to hire, and the level of knowledge or skills that you need. And then the bigger that gap is, the more difficult and expensive it is to actually carry the burden of that training program as the organization, because training is expensive. But if it's addressing these gaps, it's sometimes far less expensive than dealing with people that don't know these things, and the types of damage that can happen to an organization if people are making decisions and doing things. If you have an assembly line at a factory and people are just randomly trying to figure out how stuff goes together, you're going to have a big product recall on your hands. And that certainly applies to any organization. There's some level of knowledge that has to be there. A lot of times, though, the foundational training is paid for, by taxpayers, like public schooling. Or in the case of you folks, you're also helping that out. You or your or a family member, or a loan, or a scholarship. You and family and taxpayers, and future you, if it's student loans, are essentially subsidizing your training in order to develop a baseline level, so that an organization looks at you and says, okay, your gap between what we need you to know and what you do know is small enough that we can bring you on board. And if that's too big, it's just too expensive for them to do that. And so if you want to do that work, you have to figure out how to get closer to that gap, or even not have any gap, to come to an organization and show that you can hit the ground running. All right, all that should be pretty straightforward, I hope. So let's just sort of continue on this theme a little bit. And what is training? What do we aim it at? It isn't always job skills. Some of it could be knowledge related. So when accidents at work can be very tragic, and then on top of that, they represent huge liability to organizations, and a lot of effort is spent to train and then update that training to maintain a safe work environment. So just to give you an idea here, here's a smattering of very practical, real examples of the types of safety training you might get depending upon where you might work. So you might get security training and personal safety training. You might get training on how to prevent falls and collisions. Certainly up in the north here, it is not uncommon to have every beginning of every winter some training sent to you that you need to go in and follow, to be reminded of how to walk on icy parking lots, because people slipping and falling and breaking their hip or knocking their head on the company's icy parking lot is a big deal and represents lost work and liability for the company. So a lot of practical safety training. Proper lifting and ergonomics so that you don't get injured. How to handle chemicals so there aren't accidents. How to prevent fires, how to respond in an emergency. There's a lot of training in corporate America right now around how not, and pretty much any major organization, in making sure that everybody that is connected to the organization's network has enough awareness to prevent hacks, to prevent phishing intrusions and those sorts of things. So cybersecurity training is quite common. General intellectual property training, how to make sure that you protect the IP of your organization. A lot of harassment prevention training, a lot of diversity training. The typical American corporation right now is investing tremendous amounts of energy on diversity training. There's often things on healthy lifestyles, especially when companies are paying for the health insurance of their employees. By helping their employees be more healthy, it actually reduces long-term costs. Really any training that might help the organization. And of course, anything you do with training has to align with the law. You can't be discriminatory in who does or doesn't receive training along the lines of protected classes. All right, so who provides the training? Schools, obviously. Here we are at a university, and this is training to help you in your career. It's training geared towards development, but it's training nonetheless. Within the K-12 system, that is typically to learn language. Not necessarily the spoken language, but the complexity of it, and the reading aspect of it. There's a lot of norms that are taught during those early formative years, and baseline knowledge. And then when you get to a vocational school or a college or university, or in many cases on the job type training, but this subject we're talking about here, schools, there the knowledge and skills can become much more complex or much more specific. And there's also things that are shorter term, and this space is actually interesting and evolving. Things like boot camps and certification programs, shorter termed, narrow targeted training for things like programming skills, web development, that sort of thing. And then often the organization itself provides the training. So I gave you the example of McDonald's and Hamburger U, where they'll often have dedicated training locations. Like a large, Hamburg University is really training like future managers or existing managers of McDonald's restaurants. They're not. You don't go out to another state to learn when to listen to the alarm to tell you the fries are done. So where they apply this depends. And so an organization, McDonald's, would do their training on how to cook the fries, as on the job. But within an organization, sometimes it makes sense to have a dedicated training organization, at a specific location too. One place is large companies that have like certain types of sales skills that are needed, certain types of product knowledge. Their sales cycles may be complicated, and they want to make sure their sales force, their marketing face, is uniform, and has all the same baseline skills. And so there might be like you go to the headquarters and you go through your sales training so that you properly represent the product. That you can also obviously have training by your organization that's on site where you work, or online. As I previously mentioned, this is equal opportunity employment, basically the federal law, state law regarding who does or doesn't get training also applies here. Or you might farm out your training. You might bring external partners in. They might form as consultants, or it might be an outside partnership that makes online training available to your organization or people that actually come on site. Now, training objects. So another way of looking at this is when you are an organization and you're looking at training, like what are the elements of that? What are the things that you need to figure out to make sure that you're doing this right? And so the first thing would be like a needs assessment. And there you're looking at, and you can do this for yourself too. You can look at your own individual goals, but the organization can look at the overall goals of the organization down to the particular goals of a particular department or product line or division or whatever. And they're looking to assess the needs. Where do we have gaps? Where do we have opportunities? Where if we could improve performance, we could improve our top line or our bottom line, which is to say we could sell more stuff or make more money on what we sell. Assuming using a for-profit example, but similar things would apply if it was a government organization or a nonprofit. How can you become more effective, and where is there problems or where there are opportunities? So you do a needs assessment, and then you're going to do an organizational analysis based on that needs. So where are those training needs most acutely needed? Where if you identify an area in your needs assessment, a knowledge gap, who in the organization, where in the organization is that gap most acute, and where do you bring the most training resources to? And then you look at down to the job level. So remember the what and the how, the tasks and the KSAOs. What are the gaps or the potential opportunities? Are they specific tasks, or is it the KSAOs associated with those tasks that should be targeted by the training? And then you're getting down to the who. Okay, you've identified what in your organization needs to be addressed, and you've identified sort of broadly where in your organization. You've taken it down to the job level. Now you need to take it to the person level of the people in the job. Who needs to get this training, and what kind of training? How are you delivering it? And maybe it's just the most inexperienced people are creating the most problems, or represent the biggest lost opportunity, and the people that are really experienced don't need this training, or it could be backwards. If it represents new technology, that the newer people you've hired are more native to that, and maybe people that aren't as digitally native need to basically get some sort of rudimentary training on like how to use an app. But anyway, you're eventually going to get to the person analysis. And one place you can mine for information is in performance appraisals. So who in the job, in the area that's needed, in the organization, who hasn't been performing well enough in this area, and so you can take it all the way back to a performance appraisal. All right, so now that you've figured out what you need to train on, where in the organization, what specific jobs, and who the people are, how do you find trainers? Who should be training? How do you achieve the training in a consistent manner. You want effective training. You want it to proper transfer, and you would certainly like it to be reliable, so that everybody that gets the training all gets proper training transfer. And the way you can do that, the best way to do that, all other things being equal, is with professional instructors, because training is an art. Training is its own skill, and teaching those teaching skills, the ability to teach properly, it doesn't just automatically come with whatever expertise is that you need to have taught, because sometimes your SMEs, your subject matter experts, could be, fairly poor teachers. Whereas a professional teacher is, by definition, attempting to, or may have, mastered the art of teaching. But here's the rub, and it should be glaringly obvious. They don't always have the knowledge or have mastered mastered what needs to be taught. So sometimes an organization has sort of broad needs, the types of training needs that lots of organizations also need, and so you can find professional trainers that go from organization to organization, or if your one organization is big enough, dedicated trainers that can work full-time within the organization for certain types of skills. But often organizations have unique skills, in any, especially like down to the job level. It can get harder and harder to find professional trainers that have that specific skills. And then it gets more and more expensive if that's what you want to do. Because, you can bring in a professional trainer and spend a bunch of time to actually have them learn the job and develop a training program around the specific job. But that will take a long time and cost a lot of money. So one of the things that's often accompanying a training program is this thing called Train the Trainer. And that's where maybe you're bringing professional trainers in that just have really good teaching skills, and you need to give them the knowledge so that they can train. Or these might be non-professional people, but they might be people that actually know how to do this work, but they're not good teachers. So you need to actually train them in some basic teaching skills, one way or the other. All right, so let's talk about prior to training, sort of the pre-training environment, and this is what the organization is facing. Get back here. All right, so what's your strategy? What is the resources available? How are you going to go about this training? What policies does your organization have around training? Does training, like how much training you've had, does that actually affect your pay? And there are jobs that it does. Like, you're not having trained means that you can't be asked to do more complicated things in some cases. And so by getting the training, now more and more complicated things are unlocked for you that then commensurately come with higher pay. So there are times in which training is actually a gateway to higher pay. Certainly not always. And how are you going to track that training? And then some other things that factor in the pre-training environment is, okay, what's the supervisor's perspective? What's their general attitude about this training? Does the leadership, and that would include the immediate supervisor, do they look at this assessment? Did they perform the assessment, or was this assessment performed by higher ups or some other part of the organization or human resources? How bought in are they that this in the needs assessment? If all of a sudden you say to them that, hey, you need to have 2 days worth of training on half your people that don't have more than X experience or performed lower than whatever in your performance appraisal, you might think, well, that's a big waste of time. Or you might be the one that identified this. So what is the supervisor? What's the leadership's perspective? How supportive are they of the time and investment for this training? And then where do you get the trainers? Who are the training resources themselves? And then what's the level of participation in the needs assessment? And that's not just the supervisor. Did the supervisor participate in the needs assessment? That can also be, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, is to what extent did you have the person that is going to be trained involved in the at least some level the determination of whether they needed that training. All right, so then now we'll continue with this pre-training environment and talk about the people being trained, the trainees. So what's the makeup of the people being trained? What is the Can everybody learn in a classroom environment, or are a bunch of people remote? Do people have disabilities? What is that general individual difference among the people to be trained? And then what's their expectations? If they're not bought in that this training is needed, and you're telling them that they need to go to another facility for 3 days, be away from their families in order to get trained on something that they don't see the value in, it's you're setting yourself up for pretty poor transfer of that training, and some disengaged employees. So you want to line up the expectations, ideally, that the people being trained also agree that this is a good idea. And then what's the motivation level? So that's where having the trainees have some level of voice in what they're going to be trained on, having them some participation to say, yeah, I agree this training would be beneficial. Yes, I understand why it is that the organization would want me to have this knowledge or this skill or this whatever, and I think it would be good for me. And yeah, this is a great idea. Thank you for, in some cases, thank you for paying for this, because it's not only is this going to help me in my job and make it a little bit more likely that I might get a raise or a promotion, but if everything goes south with this company, it's skills that I can take with me and put on my resume to help me get another job. So I'm really grateful you're providing this training. I mean, that does happen. And then the other side of it, which is, this is bullshit. Why am I going through this training? This is a big waste of my time. This insults me. This is boring. I got better things to do. And that motivation or lack thereof is certainly going to be correspond to how they approach the training. And if they're not motivated, they're not going to learn as much. And likewise, the people doing the training, if they're not professional trainers, what's their motivation? Are they being dragged along because, hey, you know how to do this, and there's other people on the team, they don't know how to do that, so guess what, you're the trainer. That person might be, screw that, I don't want to waste my time teaching these noobs. I'm just trying to do my job. And so if the trainer is also not motivated, it's going to affect the transfer. And then things like personality. There's some interesting things of people who feel that they have an internal locus of control, which is to say that some of that, it's kind of mindset, like, are you the agent in your own life, or do things happen to you? That goes along with this notion of self-efficacy. It's kind of manifests as confidence. But people that feel like they're in control of their own life and are confidently moving forward in their life will often be more receptive and internalize and learn what's being presented to them. All other things being equal, these are tendencies, and certainly, like anything related to personality, these are effects that play out on the long average, and certainly not situation to situation. All right, so let's go through some types of training here, pretty high level. On-the-job training is perhaps the most common. That's hey, get down and learn how to do it. Ask people when you need help, or let me show you a little bit, and you'll kind of figure it out. And lots of different ways of doing it. So it's practical. It's obviously hands-on because you're doing it on the job. It tends to have good transfer because there you are. It's relevant. You're not dealing in hypotheticals. You're not looking at PowerPoint slides. You're in there doing it. And it tends to be inexpensive. Tends to be. You certainly don't necessarily want to have a hand-on-the-job training of here, just figure it out, making things where one mistake can cost a ridiculous amount of money. So these things are contextual. And then often the other employees end up being the trainers. Sometimes formally, where you'll actually have what are called OJTs, or on-the-job trainers. They're people who know how to do the work. And they have an extra designation where they're the ones that teach with the new employees, and sometimes that's like a stepping stone for potentially future supervisory capabilities. Semi-formal or formal. Sometimes OJTs get a little bit of extra money, but oftentimes, because every job's a little bit different, and it's difficult to have a formal OJT for every type of job. If you have 75 employees in your organization and it seems like you have 74 different jobs, then it can be a little bit harder to sort of generalize with dedicated OJTs or even partially dedicated. So oftentimes, whoever's been around, or maybe if you're backfilling somebody but they haven't left yet, The current people are the trainers, and that is good and that is bad. So I mean, it's good in that those are people that actually know how to do the job. They know which buttons to press and where things are and that sort of thing. And then the bad is it's all over the map in terms of what kind of motivation, what kind of teaching skills you're going to have. So it's it depends on how that sometimes it works well and sometimes it really doesn't. And then there's other types of training like job rotations, and that's where you might just as a trainee, rotate to different jobs, and the purpose of that is often just to get you better breadth, give you a better perspective on the organization, set you up for more flexibility at a later date when the organization maybe has a change in what their demand is, and they need you to do something else, so they use some downtime to get you trained up in an area in anticipation. But that requires, frequent moves. And depending on your organization, that literally could be you have to go move to another town for a while. But in other cases, it just means you have to move to a different part of the factory or the office downtown or whatever, or just moving to a different area in the same building, but it's around people you don't know as well, and and there's a cost associated with those moves. Then there's job shadowing, where you're really just observing the work directly. There's various ways you can simulate the job. I mentioned in the past in-basket. That's an old thing for when there actually was an in-basket, and you would get your paperwork would come in, and now your Outlook or whatever you use for email is called your inbox, and that's basically a carryover from that. Same reason why your emails are symbolized by little letters, because that's the old days when people used to have to communicate via mail. So often these are like software-related simulations, but they could be at like training centers. You could actually have a physical simulation, depending upon what the work environment is. And then there's apprenticeships, and often those are associated with trades. I have a picture there of hypothetically of a tailor, the senior tailor on the left there, showing the junior tailor something about tailoring. Anyway, often apprenticeships are multi-month or even many year type things, depending upon the complexity of the trade craft. All right, so let's continue on these things. Obviously, training can be online. Here we are together, sort of online. It's common for large training programs and organizations, things like compliance training, where you need to document, which you can do online. That everybody's been through this. They can obviously be one-on-one, personalized instruction. Obviously, that can be expensive too. You might be at just a meeting room with PowerPoint and a Q&A, where you could actually have a classroom environment, sort of like a back-to-school format. There's various ways. Obviously, meeting rooms and classrooms are group-type stuff, but you can have group-centered training where the group itself is interacting. You're having interactive group discussions or group problem solving. We'll keep going here. You have case studies. This can be individual or this can be group. This can be guided in different ways, but you might have a basic business problem and you're trying to figure out how to come up with a solution. And so by learning through a case study, you're getting, at least theoretically, broader knowledge. There's things like business games, and often that's done in groups and facilitated, and it's often gamified, but it's designed around basically teaching business acumen, which is to say the stuff you'd get in an MBA, at least elements of that, or group problem solving or decision making. And when more people in the organization have basic business acumen, and they understand a little bit more things, a little bit more strategically, understand things a little bit more in terms of profit and loss, they make better decisions all around at the working level. There's role playing, where the trainer and the trainee basically mock up situations to learn in a hypothetical environment. There's behavior modeling, where the trainer will basically demonstrate something. It might be demonstrating a behavior. Here's how to act in a more professional way, and here's how you facilitate a business meeting, and then you'd have the trainee then attempt to model that. There's various ways of doing coaching. And that can be just individual guidance around a skill improvement. In one place, we'd mentioned appraisals, and I mentioned 360-degree appraisals, and that those are typically done at the leader level. There's a thing called executive coaching, which is sort of advanced interpersonal leadership skills. All right, so this isn't really types of training, but it is an aspect of training. And we would be remiss not to talk about practice. At this point, certainly, it wouldn't surprise me if you haven't been exposed to most of this stuff at some level, and it's good to get a refresher of it. Some element may have been in introductory psych classes, or you may have heard it in basic academic skills classes. Being actively practicing, actively engaging your mind and attempting to learn something, not sitting there passively. Obviously, that is a more effective approach in general. But when you think about practice, how is it? How time-based is it? How is it big chunks or is it little chunks? And so ways of looking at it is like mass practice, and that's less sessions and longer. So imagine if this class, instead of being, roughly an hour or so, depending upon how many squirrels I chase, was 6 hours. How much would you learn? And, what would be good and bad about that? And then versus distributed practice, which is, you could argue that's what these classes are. You could distribute them even more, and these would be a whole bunch of 10-minute chunks and that sort of thing. So that's more practice, but shorter. And generally speaking, distributing them out, generally speaking, more but shorter is typically more effective than massed. I mean, there's a break point where it's silly. You wouldn't you wouldn't want 7,000 practice sessions of 15 seconds each, because you wouldn't be able to put the pieces together. So there's sort of a natural spot. And I mean, people argue about like what it is, and you'll find schools of thought that'll say, really the 15-minute increment is the perfect increment, or but the school is still out on it, sort of pun intended. There's a number of people studying this. There's a lot of psychology that studies learning, and it works hand in glove with people who study education to try to make the classroom environment and classroom materials better and more effective, and try to help with people to get habits. And this is still evolving. It isn't set, other than this level that I'm teaching you. And then everybody adds an individual difference to this. If you are hell bent to learn something, and it's and you're super fascinated by the topic, and you really want to understand all of it, I mean, you're bringing a level of motivation to the learning that affects what learning type would be most effective for you. Whereas if you were bored out of your gourd and just going through the motions, it's debatable what, if any, learning approach would be effective. So the context matters a great deal, which is why it's difficult to be too prescriptive on these sorts of things. Retrieval practice, now that's really where you're learning along the way. As you're learning new material, you sort of stop yourself and then try to remember, hey, what did I just learn? And that might be done, like a halfway through knowledge check. Like if I suddenly blanked the screen and said, hey, what are the types of practices I just talked about? Think about it. So right now you're doing a retrieval exercise, and maybe you thought, there's like massed, and what was the other thing? And there's like active, what was that again? And then what was it by massed? That's like a big chunk, and then the other one was like spread out, and that's distributed. And what I'm doing right now is retrieval. So by if you participated in this during my little pause there, you were creating an event in your brain where you're trying to find something. And that little retrieval exercise, trying to remember. If you remember the previous lecture about, you get strong by feeling weak in weightlifting, and you can get smarter by feeling dumb if you embrace it, if you move towards it, because that's what that struggling is what's that's your old systems telling you that, okay, you're trying to learn something, but it's going to take resources, it's going to take calories, so I'm going to make it feel hard for you, so that you don't proceed unless it matters, and how important it is to push through that. So this is kind of hard, that is the signal, if you push through it, that you're unlocking neural plasticity. And so by doing that little retrieval exercise, if you did it, and tried for a moment to remember, you would actually be sort of priming your brain a little biochemically to tag the synapses that did form, and then or fired, and then if you got a good night's sleep tonight, you'd come in and sort of wire them up better. So I mean, it's fast. It's absolutely fascinating topic, and getting a good night's sleep, learning something, getting a rest, and then being tested on it, often it shows up better performance than learning something, spending the same amount of time but not resting, but not being a sleep deprived situation or anything like that. But just going away from it and actually resting appears to be needed for overall learning processes. But it's the tagging of what parts of your brain need to be wired stronger as they were sort of only temporarily wired. That tagging appears to be coming from that whole retrieval effort, that effortful retrieval. This is a super powerful piece of information that you encompass in your life if you're paying attention. Okay, so practice. That should be pretty obvious to you, the value of that. And that whole retrieval effort, effortful retrieval, wherever you're doing it, and doing it along the way. This is a great thing to do when you're reading, like if you're reading a difficult book and you finish a paragraph or you finish a page, stop. Maybe close the book, maybe look away from the book, and then go, what did I just learn? And try to recall some of it, try to summarize some of it. That habit of doing that can actually make future recall much better and be able to synthesize all the knowledge much better. Yeah, I struggle to do it sometimes when I'm learning new material. I like to just keep going because I don't like to be taken out of it. But I do believe it's definitely more effective if you do stop and do some retrieval exercises along the way. So anyway, something to think about. And in general, learning in small chunks makes it easier than learning large chunks. Okay, so what do we do when we're done with training? What's the post-training environment? Well, knowledge checks. Did you learn it? And that's about documenting that the training was in fact transferred. And it's common in corporate America where you have online training for various things to have a knowledge check. So you can't just go through the motions and click through the slides and not pay any attention. The same thing that happens while you have unit tests in this class to ensure that you do pay attention to a certain amount, engage a certain amount, and increase the likelihood that this information is transferred. Within organizations, you'll often have metrics, various business measures, and if you've identified certain gaps in training have led to loss in sales or loss in quality of your product or whatever, you can look at sales, you can look at product quality, as metrics that you hope to go up after you've invested in the training. Or you can do surveys as well, if surveys are, to the extent that you can craft survey questions that, based on how you answer them, would indicate some level of training transfer. There's certainly certain types of knowledge that really short of a test aren't going to come up in a survey question. So it really depends. And then various follow-up. What is a supervisor doing after the training? What are they doing to reinforce that the new behaviors, if it's training that it's going to drive different work behaviors, how is the supervisor reinforcing that new behavior learned in training is manifested? What things are happening to prevent sort of relapses? If this is like learning new types of skills, but they're difficult things or they're interpersonal things, and there's a tendency to regress. What are you doing to what can you do and what are you doing to prevent relapse? And one of the most important things on post-training is to make sure that there is an opportunity to use what it was taught. If you learn something and it's interesting to you, but then you move on with your life and at no point do you have to ever apply that knowledge, you'll find it harder and harder to recall it. And so fairly soon after training, being able to put that training to use, and then following up and making sure there's some sort of frequency by which one can apply that training can be very powerful to make sure there's recall. In an ideal situation, you get you learn training and then right away the next day or whatever, right on the job, you immediately can apply that training. And forever on, when you're doing your job, there's some element of that training at play. But that's often not applicable to the types of training you're going to get. So, because they often are training that's for a behavior or a knowledge that only applies in certain situations. So it's important to actually make sure you're in those situations if you can, so that that transfer kicks in and holds. All right, so last slide here, just give some perspective on organizations and whether they do or don't spend money on training, and we'll look at one very important driver of deciding priorities of training, and that's labor shortages. And there's a supply and demand that applies to labor just like it applies to everything. You know, during COVID, there was a brief run on toilet paper because of a weird supply and demand thing, and some of it was there was only so much capacity in the country for producing toilet paper that goes to your home, and there was only so much capacity that went to toilet paper that goes to businesses. Businesses typically had the big rolls, you know, the giant things that go in the public bathrooms. And all of a sudden, other than essential workers, everybody was home, and nobody was at these, not nobody, but very much fewer people were at these businesses. And so the demand for the toilet paper for the giant rolls went really low, and all of a sudden everybody's working at their house, and they're using the restroom at their office all day, and now it's at home, and so the need for toilet paper shot up. And the factories couldn't just switch from the giant rolls, giant dense rolls to the little soft rolls anytime soon. So then there became a shortage, and then everybody freaked out about the shortage, and hoarders were going to Costco filling up whole cartloads of toilet paper. And then we had this weird situation in the United States of America where you would go to a store and there would be barely any toilet paper, and it would say like limit, 1 package or 2 package each until it settled out. First, people calmed down a little bit. And realized that there would be a future with toilet paper, and then the factories that produced regular toilet paper were able to increase their capacity a little bit. I don't know if they were able to retool their larger rolls or not, and I just realized I've now spent several minutes talking about toilet paper. But supply and demand is a quirky thing, and supply and demand definitely also affects labor. And when you're in a situation where there's excess labor, and that's usually specific, okay, there's certain skills that are almost always forever scarce, but what's the demand? It's not just the supply, it's the demand. It's not just how scarce a skill is, it's also how many people are actually looking for that skill. So, but when there is excess labor, in certain skills or knowledge areas, that tends to lower wages. And then organizations can be pickier, and they can basically decide they're going to hire. They're going to have the market, the people, previous other companies, whatever, pay for their training needs, and so they're only going to hire people that really know what they're doing, that have the most experience, because they can do that because there's a surplus, and so then they filter out anybody that's not less trained, and they don't have to spend that much money on training. Because there's so much excess out there. But the opposite happens as well, which is you get scarcity, and certain skills and knowledge areas can become more scarce than others. But the overall effect of that is driving up wages. And then you also get organizations, if that scarcity coincides with high demand, where organizations really need those skills, and there aren't that many people, you get organizations that get into bidding wars for that talent, and organizations really hate that situation because they lose all power, and they lose all sort of power over price, and the cost of those types of people keeps going up and up, just like the cost of oil when everybody needs oil and there isn't enough supply. So that tends to drive a lot of investment in training. There you start thinking, well, okay, we can't find the people with experience, so let's hire less experienced people and let's make the investment into training because we don't have any other choice. And so you often have an increase in the in-house training that's available, and you'll often have more money spent on things like tuition reimbursement, which is, hey, we need more people that know this kind of software or this kind of whatever. If you are willing to go to school for that part-time, typically, we'll pay for your classes, and you'll have the skills that and when you get them, you'll be at a higher pay grade, or we'll promote you, and you'll now have those marketable skills. You still have to do the work. We don't have the infrastructure to do this training, but the university does, or this software boot camp does, or whatever. But we'll pay for it. So that's a common thing that happens during labor shortages. In the current situation in the United States, for labor is tight, and that's actually right now across multiple sectors. So it's a strange situation right now. So you'd actually see that obviously this drives more training, but it'll also drive more automation, and then not having the people, even the people that you could train up. When you're in a chronic situation of scarcity, people tend to drive a lot of change in innovation and automation. All right, that is the end of our lecture. Hope it was interesting. We will see you for lecture 20.